Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and in this one, we're going to be talking about the most dangerous team of supervillains ever. But before we get into that, smash that like button, check to see if you're still subscribed, and as always, leave us a comment. That helps us out with the YouTube algorithm, but also we love hearing from you guys. We have an awesome community here, and that's all thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. So now that we have the intro out of the way, I'm going to attempt to explain this one, and this one's kind of hard to explain. So bear with me. In the late 90s, I was running a series of adventures set in our game world, but it was fantasy. And it was like a prequel to the stuff we were normally doing. And I came up with this idea that I would go to all of our players and basically ask them, who is your main guy that you play the most, or who is the most important guy that you play, right? And now I want you to make a new character who is an ancestor of his, who would be an adventurer in the Middle Ages, right? And so that was then the fantasy team. And I was trying to play around with ideas like destiny and fate and stuff like that. The idea that these certain bloodlines in our game world were going to be like really important for some reason, right? Well, at any rate, so in the middle of that campaign, and there were lots of villains, and they were all fantasy related villains, right? Well, in the middle of all that, I brought in this guy, and he kind of looked like one of the men in black. And instead of wearing, the black suit and tie and then a white dress shirt, this guy wore a black suit and tie, but a purple dress shirt. And he looked like John Redbridge. And back then, everybody referred to John Redbridge as the Bear. It was a nickname they gave him. It's kind of a long story. He looked just like a video game character from an old arcade game called Metamorphic Force, who was a bear. And so, like, I mean, he was like a werebear. He could turn into a bear, but in his human form, everybody thought he looked like my character. And so that's where the whole bear thing came from. But that's a little outside of the point. The point is, they gave this guy the nickname Purple Bear. Later, years later, we would call him Overlord, is like his official villain name. But really, that's a pretty recent addition to the idea. For the bigger chunk of time there, everybody just called him the Purple Bear. So what he would do is he had this black pyramid, and in my mind, I was kind of ripping off the TARDIS from Doctor Who with this black pyramid, and it had an eye on one side of it, kind of like the symbol, like on the dollar bill, that kind of thing. And that was just a circular, like the whole thing. It was like covered in circuits, kind of like Borg technology or something. But you know how the Borg is like a black cube with like glowing green stuff on it, right? This was glowing purple, like a black light. And so it had a perfectly circular eye on one side of it that was also a weapon where it could fire like a laser out of that purple eye. And the point is, underneath the eye then was a door. And when the door would open, the outside of the cube, was clearly smaller than the inside of the cube. Again, ripping off the TARDIS. And just like the TARDIS, it could travel through time and space. And so this guy would show up, and let's say they were fighting some villain like in a canyon. He would do stuff like have his pyramid appear like up on the cliff, kind of out of their reach. And he would just walk out and watch them. He'd just stand there with his hands behind his back or something like that, which is kind of a classic villain pose. And he would just watch them and sort of study them. And so on the one hand, he wasn't really seeming to do anything. But on the other hand, like for whatever reason, that kind of irritated the players. Like they saw the color scheme and associated it with villainy, and you know what I mean? Even the pose. I remember Matt Nip at the time saying something about how that was like the classic villain pose, like Darkseid does that a lot. So they would go to attack him, and I would just have a force field around him and his pyramid that they could not get through. And then that irritated him that they couldn't actually hurt him, right? And then he would just leave and the pyramid would just vanish. And so there was no way they could follow him, right? And it got under their skin. And I thought that was very interesting. And he creeped him out more than I thought he would. And so then a couple more times, I would just have him do the same thing. He'd show up, basically do nothing. They were still bothered by him, and they were annoyed that he could just get away when he wanted to. They were really bothered that they couldn't like knock him out or whatever, right? They sort of felt like he was winning, even though he wasn't really doing anything, right? And so I decided that that was kind of cool, and that would be the level I would leave him on for a really long time. And when I say a long time, I mean I did that for like 20 years. Like literally from the late 90s up until pretty much 2022, he never really did anything, but he kept showing up in multiple time periods. So, like, we would be running a game set in World War II, and the players would be doing completely other stuff. They'd be completely other characters, by the way. And he'd just show up and watch them. And a lot of the players who'd been playing with me for ages, right? They would know who he was. And they'd be like, oh, it's this guy. I hate this guy. And then they would kind of tell the newer players, and they'd be like, "Oh, okay, I gotcha." And then they'd hate this guy too. And then if the older player, for whatever reason, they just get busy having kids and a family and all that, they don't really want to play on weekends anymore. They want to do stuff with their family instead. They would drop out of the game or whatever. And then the newer players, like it'd be like my wife's friends or something like that. Well, now they hate this guy and are kind of teaching the next generation after them that they should hate him too, right? So it's this whole big thing. And it was such a ridiculous amount of time to be teasing this guy as a big deal. And because he always got away, he, like I sort of said, I think, he had kind of this reputation for like, I don't know if being unbeatable, like, I don't know if that's the right way to word it, but you get the general idea there, hopefully, right? And so I came up with this idea then in 2022 that there were a lot of characters. And this was actually my son helped come up with this idea because he hates dangling plot threads. And so like I'll give you a real quick one. The guy here that we have a picture of for the channel art this week, um he was played by my brother-in-law who's a big military guy, and so he named him Jarhead. He was supposed to be a super soldier. And there was actually this video game on social media that I was playing around this time. And I can't remember the name of the game at all. I would play it on Facebook, and it was one of those games where like you would log in and you would fight supervillains and you could design your own character. You got to pick your superpowers. You got to make a headquarters, so on and so forth. Then you go on these missions. And it was sort of like a role-playing game. And the weird thing was the stats for this game were like eerily similar to DC Heroes, which really, really, really made me wonder if the people that made the game were actually fans of DC Heroes. So the character I made, I based on pre-crisis Superman, and I just kept giving him all of Superman's qualities. And so even his stats, he had a dex of 26 and a strength of 50 and a body of 40, just like Superman does. And I kept going through the game and I was beating everybody and so on and so forth. And eventually I get to what is basically this guy that you see here. And you go out to, I don't know where it was supposed to take place, Area 51 or something like that out west. And it shows a picture of this soldier with his shirt off, and they photoshopped him to just make him huge. Like he is way bigger than a human being could ever be, right? And his stats were just all 60s. So he had Dex 60, Strength 60, and Body 60. And so my guy couldn't lay a finger on him. And by the way, this soldier was like so much tougher than all the bad guys that you'd encountered before him, right? And so no matter what I did, I couldn't beat this guy. And like I was just at a dead end in the game. You couldn't go any further in the game until you beat this guy. So it kind of ruined that game for me. And then other people that were friends of mine, they were playing the game, they had the same problem where they couldn't get by this guy. And I don't think they ever gave him a name in this video game or anything like that, but we took the concept and we said, you know what? He's in our game. Like we're so mad. We're going to use our actual role-playing characters and beat on the knockoff we made of this guy. And then the great irony was in our game, nobody could beat him. And it was really making us mad. And then finally, John Redbridge fought him and just threw him into the sun. And I was like, screw it, you go in there. And we came up with the idea that he had sealed systems because various other characters had tried to do stuff like Green Lantern tried to put a bubble over his head and suffocate him. That didn't work. So we knew he didn't need air and yada, yada, yada. We kind of based him on characters like, say, Lobo, in terms of sort of a lot of their stats and powers and stuff. Um, so the irony was he had so much regeneration and stuff like that. He had so much invulnerability. I think he had 60 APs of invulnerability. So every time he would start to go in the negatives, like burning up in the sun or whatever, that invulnerability would kick in and push him way back up into the positives again. And it would slowly burn him until he went in the negatives and it would push him back up again. So, like, even being in the sun did not kill this guy, right? And that's just one example of that happening. Also, in the mid to late 90s, sometime, Jay Mora, who had been the game master before me, he came home for Christmas or something like that. I don't know what it was anymore, why he was home, but he was home. We were hanging out. We were playing role playing games, and he ran a game for me. I guess this would be around the year 2000 now that I think about it. So that might have been right around the time we were going to buy the local comic shop. But point being, so Jay ran a game for me where he played a character named Crichton. And the stats he used were for Raven's dad from DC, Trigon, who was like a major demon character, right? I honestly think Jay just wasn't paying attention when he read it, and I think that he was thinking of like Aquaman's trident or whatever. You know what I mean? Like I think he just glanced at it, was like, "Yeah, that's good." And so he didn't run him as like a powerful demon or anything. He ran him as more of like a cosmic version of the creature from the Black Lagoon, right? And so he was like he still had all of those stats. He was crazy powerful. So John Redbridge fights him and can't beat him, which is pretty out there for John Redbridge. That doesn't happen too often, right? So they fight for like a while, like I don't know, 10 rounds or something, and they're not really getting anywhere. Neither one can really beat the other one. And this Triton character has like super swimming and things like that, but he can't fly. So John Redbridge throws him in the sun. And that's kind of his whole thing is like, you know what? If I keep running into these guys, I can't beat them. I'm going to keep throwing them into the sun. So this went on for a while. And so we finally decided that the Purple Bear, aka Overlord, had seen enough of this and he saw these guys who were so tough that the various heroes of the game world couldn't think of another thing to do with them, right? So he breaks them out of the sun. He creates with the pyramid, we gave it the warp power where it can create sort of like wormholes outside of the pyramid. So I don't want you to have the wrong idea that like a portal opens up inside of the sun and then the other portal is like in the control room of the pyramid. That's not the case at all. He actually just opens one end of the portal at the heart of the sun because the gravity of the sun had pulled all these guys in there where they were bumping into each other and stuff like that. So that's where he opens the portal. And then on the other end is just out into space. So when that portal in space opens, like all this fire shoots out of it, because of course it's all that force at the center of the sun, and the villains get ejected out of the portal, and then he closes that portal and the fire kind of dissipates in space. So these guys are tumbling through space, and then he opens a portal into liminal space. And so this was the first time this was kind of my son's idea. I think this is right around the time that the back rooms became more known to the general public. You know what I mean? Like, I guess there's still people who've never heard of the back rooms, and there were probably people before that who had heard of the back rooms, but like for the majority of my friends, anyways, this is around the time we got wind of it. You know what I mean? And thought it was kind of a cool idea. So these villains then get dumped inside of this dimension. And the idea is that the entire dimension is made out of rooms like the one you see here, right? Like all the walls are kind of yellow or tan or something. A lot of the stuff in here is out of date stuff. It's kind of timeless where we hadn't really picked an exact like year that it was supposed to be. In fact, I put a calendar in there and I can't remember what year we said the calendar said now, but it was this nonsensical, like it was the year 1970 12 or something like that, right? Like I went out of my way to come up with a thing that like was not a real number. And anytime people looked at clocks or calendars or anything like that, like they were always weird. They like that was never the way stuff like that in the real world is, right? And and so at any rate, it was this endless dimension of that really sort of like shallow old office carpeting that is short enough that like the wheels of your chair can roll on it, you know what I mean? And old file cabinets and really crappy old computers. And the computers kind of didn't make sense because we were trying to describe what would basically be like, what if they had like a 90s style desktop computer? Like, what if they made those in the 60s? Right. So we tried to give this whole place like it was simultaneously familiar yet otherworldly. And then one of the other things we did was in our classic role-playing games with the Continuum, uh, we through gameplay, we were going on adventures where we would be low on hit points and we got frustrated and we would be like, when Dungeons and Dragons is the thing we're playing, there are healing potions so that, I can have this on my person, I can get it out in the middle of a fight, take a drink of glowing blue liquid or something like that and get some hit points back and then keep fighting, right? And this is like a really useful game mechanic that we didn't have anything like that in our superhero game. So Ryan Miller was playing the Team Gadgeteer, and so he made something that did the same thing using science, right? We even said it was a glowing blue liquid. And our ruling on it back then was because we sort of equated it to some kind of really potent medicine, right? That it's giving you hit points back, even if you had, like, say, a gunshot wound or something. So, therefore, that's why we thought it was like really, really strong stuff. So, we decided it must therefore taste bad. Like, it must be incredibly bitter, just horrible stuff. So, to make it more palatable, My character Powerhouse had the idea, let's like bake it into like a candy bar, and it will literally be like the sugar that helps the medicine go down. So if you eat this candy bar, it's probably not the best candy bar you've ever had. You know what I mean? It actually is probably kind of a not great candy bar, but it's like way better than what it was before, where it's just the blue liquid by itself. So these regeneration bars were very common in our role-playing game back in the early 90s. And so, since the Purple Bear had been traveling to different time periods and watching and studying and biding his time and so on and so forth, he got his hand on a bunch of these candy bars and he stocked the vending machines here with him. So the villains, first of all, the villains had never met each other, and this was a villain's campaign. So every single villain in this game was a player character, and again, these were all sort of like the toughest villains from through the years. So like Scott was playing the super soldier guy. Um my son was playing a character named uh Patrick Rick Greenbrook the second, who was the son of an old villain from our game named Patrick. Um let's see who was my wife played a character named Copycat, who sort of like she looks like Chitara from the 2011 Thundercats, but her color scheme was based on Lionel. And she had been a hero, and then she screwed the heroes over and became a traitor, which made her kind of notorious in the hero community. So she was there. And then my daughter was playing Triton because my daughter loves aquatic characters. I'm trying to think who else, because like Kayla was playing somebody. I can't remember now who was playing who. But let's see, who am I leaving out? Um, Absolute Zero was the equal opposite counterpart to Ryan Miller's character. And so they're both super smart genius guys. But then Ryan's character Pulsar was really, really fast. Absolute Zero's thing is he could slow the world down while he stayed the same. So it was sort of like the illusion of speed. Does that make sense? Or like when he would fight Pulsar, he would just turn Pulsar's speed down until they were both moving at like normal speed and just canceled it out. And then Pulsar's other big power was fire. And so then Absolute Zero could do ice. Um, but the whole idea of that character was based around the idea that if something reaches a temperature of absolute zero, it is a complete and total lack of movement at the subatomic scale or whatever, right? You know what I mean? So that was that character. And then Agent D was a really interesting dude. So I mentioned in the Crisis game, the 1997 Crisis, that the guy who was my best friend in college, Kelson Barber, at one point, was going to destroy this tuning fork. He was going to, I mean, honestly, he was going to destroy the whole game world. And Kelson had apologized for that years later. So um, I want to be careful how I talk about it, where I'm not trying to like throw stuff in his face or bring up the past or whatever. But but at any rate, like the way that the heroes dealt with that was time traveling heroes from the future went back and took him out because that was also the last game he ever played in. So, yeah, the guys from the future went back and it was an assassination thing, right? And then the game world lived on and so on and so forth. Well, so we find out that there was a girl who used to play in the game named Denise Kroninger, and she made a character named Dementia. And there used to be this cartoon called what is it called? Defenders of Dynatron City, I think. Which I loved this cartoon, but one of the things they did in it was they had this mad scientist as sort of like a science experiment or whatever. He sort of like contaminates a bunch of drinks in vending machines so that it is sort of like triggering the X gene when you drink this like mutagen stuff. And so it gives a bunch of people powers. And so we had done that in our game. And she was one of the ones who got these powers. And it actually gave her a split personality. And it made her hair turn kind of a greenish yellowish color. And her skin got real white. And I want to say the whites of her eyes turned black. And then the colored part of the eye was like a really, really light grayish, kind of a zombie white-eyed kind of a thing. Um, she was actually really pretty, but like she had like a definitely like an eerie kind of an appearance. But her power was if she was around you, she had all of your powers. So it was a little like Rogue, but it was ranged. And then sort of like as soon as you would leave, she loses that power, right? You have to be within range of her. And mind you, her range was pretty good. I'm trying to remember if it was like if she was within like half a mile of you or a quarter mile or something like that. Because I remember we were doing adventures on our college campus and we were talking about characters on other parts of the campus were still close enough that she was getting their powers. But at any rate, so in our game, she gives birth to the son of Kelson, who grows up, and that's who this character is, Agent D. And that was one of the reasons we did the letter D was because Kelson's superhero name was Dante, and then Denise's name and like she played the characters kind of like crazy, not really good or bad, just sort of like crazy. But then her superhero name was Dementia because she was demented, I guess, was the idea. But because they're both D words, that's why we named him Agent D. But so then he had the mom's powers, and then in addition to that, he could biologically do everything a Green Lantern could do. So he didn't need a ring. He could just shoot Force Nip out of his hands and stuff. So he was on the team. And so anytime people tried to fight him, he had all of their powers, right? And then when he's around this group of unbeatable villains, he has all their powers, right? So he's a massive uh, issue. I mentioned Copycat already. The Dauntain, man, that's a guy that a lot of people thought was really creepy. We based him on um, the Changeling, the Dreaming games have a thing in there called a Dauntain. So this guy was like a huge dude who would capture and torture Fey characters, and he had been a recurring villain in multiple adventures, and just nobody could ever deal with him. He was always just kind of one step ahead. Man, I don't really know what to even compare him to. He was a little like a cross between the Incredible Hulk and like Boba Fett and like I'm trying to think of somebody who's just like a master planner. I don't know. I can't even think. But then he had like an iron cage backpack kind of thing that he wore around because iron is a problem for most fairy creatures. And then he'd like put them in there and they'd just be weak. They couldn't do anything once they were in the cage. Would kind of shut all their powers down and stuff. He um he had figured out the op like the changelings, their sort of power source in a way is glamour. It's like positivity and like happy memories and stuff like that. The Dauntain was the master of the opposite. He had figured out how to sort of weaponize like misery and just negativity and stuff like that. And um yeah, he was an extremely dangerous character. Dr. Hadron. He was a villain I made who was a knockoff of Dr. Manhattan from Watchmen. He was just straight up another Dr. Manhattan from a random universe with some long serial number of a name. And he was a problem. And nobody could beat him. Just no matter what other people did to him, like it never worked. Hypnos was a big deal. We've talked about him on the channel. There's a Hypnos adventure in ancient Greece. His whole thing is whatever you think is happening was not what's happening, right? That it's in your head. What is actually happening is Hypnos has probably captured you and has you chained to a wall or something like that, right? But you think that you have defeated him in combat and you're getting away, or you think that you made it back to your headquarters and that everything is fine and that it's a week later, but really you are in danger, right? And he was just the master of mental illusions and stuff like that. So yeah, he's in the group. He was very tough. High Score was like a video game based character that my son made, who was also kind of inspired by Toyman. Um, Omnicron, boy, that's a huge one. So we had defeated Necron in our main game, and he was always the main villain over the years. Well, I borrowed a page from Imperiex, where DC did these comics around 2001, I think it was, where they made like a knockoff of Galactus from Marvel, but they were saying basically that there's like a big main Imperiex that I think was called Imperiex Prime, and then a lesser Imperiex that you would encounter, like a couple of the characters. I want to say it was like Superman and Mongol. I think they go encounter one of these lesser kind of Imperiex drones, and the drone is basically a Galactus level problem, right? So they defeat the drone thinking they've beaten Imperiex, and then they find out, oh yeah, that's kind of just one of his foot soldiers. That's just a pawn in his army. You know what I mean? Like this thing that you guys thought was the ultimate thing is actually like nothing. And so uh we said that there are these Necrons through the multiverse, but they are sort of the pawns of the greater Necron that is called Omnicron. And I think I got the idea from that actually during quarantine when I was in the hospital for like 2 weeks, and like the doctors were telling me like you're never getting out of this hospital. I remember looking over at some piece of equipment that they had in my hospital room, and the name of the company that manufactured this piece of equipment was Omnicron. That's where I got it from. And I just seeing that suffix at the end, the cron, I thought, boy, something about this feels kind of weird. Like if I am going to expire in this room, right? And there's a machine here with cron in the name, like I don't know, it struck a chord with me, right? So I thought it was kind of too good to pass up. And just the fact it had the prefix of Omni, I think of Omni Power from DC Heroes, and Omni Power is kind of like the ultimate power. So I'm like, what would the ultimate Necron seem like? So that's what Omnicron was. Techno was the next guy. Techno was really interesting. He was kind of like, well, so the Techno story is this. This is one of my favorite stories we ever told. The superheroes in the late 90s and early 2000s were just letting anybody join their team. So the gist was that when somebody would make a new character, let's say we have a player named um, Josh, and he makes a new character named Edge Lord or something, right? And then Edge Lord is like a Wolverine knockoff, and he's like, "Hey, I'm Edge Lord. Can I join your team?" The other characters would just go, "Yep, here's the password to the headquarters, and here's our bank account information for the team funds, and da 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 da." Right? And I was telling them, I'm like, "Don't you guys want to like try to vet this guy first? He's just a stranger off the street." And they were like, yeah, but he's Josh's character. We know he's the character Josh rolled up. So he's on the team. And it annoyed me because, I wanted them to actually play things out, right? I wanted them to act. So I made this guy named Techno, and he applies to be a member of the team. And they're like, sure, welcome aboard. And he seemed like a Tony Stark kind of a guy, right? And so if he was a Tony Stark, then the next character I introduced was a Doctor Doom type guy. And so the Doctor Doom type character would attack, and Techno and the other heroes would fight him. And this went on for a while. I mean, this went on for maybe 6 months, where there were a lot of adventures with either my knockoff of Doctor Doom or his Doombots or his minions or something, right? And that was, I don't know, that was around the year 2000 or 2001 or something like that. But at any rate, it turns out um the main Doctor Doom type guy, if he was fighting Techno, sometimes the main Doctor Doom guy was a Doombot controlled by Techno. Sometimes Techno is wearing the Doctor Doom style armor, and the guy they think is Techno is actually like a android duplicate that Techno made. You know what I mean? So he's playing both sides, and Techno is actually a villain who joined the team. That he just decided the best way to get rid of this team that was a thorn in his side. They had been interfering with his operations. He decided the best way to take them out was to join them. And in the final adventure, he puts them all in a death trap designed just for that person. So if there was like a guy with fire powers, that guy was like underwater with just like a oxygen tube up his nose or something. And if there was like another person who had like sonic powers, they'd put him in a vacuum and just so on and so forth, right? So all these traps were designed to deal with that specific person. And the team, there was this one guy on the team named High Bounce who had like kinetic energy based abilities. And so High Bounce manages to like put his mouth on the glass of this thing that he's stuck in, and he flicks his tongue against the glass, and he creates an explosion. And it's kind of a long story, but because of that, he was able to do something weird that I had not anticipated. That allowed him to escape, and he freed the others, but then he was like horribly burnt in the process and so on and so forth. He actually went on to become a villain too. But Techno got away with all of the team's money, and the team had made a ton of money doing various things. So like Techno ran off to Europe and they never caught him. So he was another one of these guys who'd gotten away. Triton I mentioned, Vindicator I mentioned. So that's everybody, right? That's the entire team. And at any rate, the gist was just we put them in the back rooms and they start fighting. And I can't remember who it was now who started a fire, but one of them started a fire somehow. And so this place started burning and the fire was like spreading out. And it was kind of interesting because they didn't realize they were in another dimension yet. They thought they were in like an underground bunker or something. And they kept looking for like the edges of the building because they wanted to leave the building. And so this fire burns like a spherical thing out of this area that they're in that's like 10 stories tall or something, this hole. And it's like a spherical shaped hole. And then they're like standing on the edges of the hole once they've got the fire out. I think Absolute Zero helped with that or whatever. But they realize they're not even in the same dimension anymore. And it was interesting because then some of them are like, all right, look, we all hate each other, but maybe we should work together to to try to escape from this place or to do something, you know? And so then some of them were willing to work together, and then others were like just flat out refusing, like, no, screw you. I don't need anybody. And so, like, a lot of time goes by. Like, there's weeks of them being here, and the only thing to eat are those regeneration candy bars in the vending machine. So they're keeping them alive, but nobody's happy. So I thought that was very interesting. And we ran that for multiple adventures, actually, until finally the Black Pyramid shows up and it's just hovering in the center of this hole that they made, right? And so they finally come face to face with Overlord. And just through talking to him, and I didn't even roll dice to intimidate him or anything like that, but just through talking to them, everybody but Vindicator is sort of like scared of Overlord. And they think that he's just sort of like one step ahead and that he put them here. And if he really wanted to, he could have put them someplace worse. He for sure has the ability to put them right back in the sun again, right? Where they're burning and feeling pain and, stuff like that. So it was really interesting though, because then Vindicator, my son is like so proud of this to this day. He actually got under Overlord's skin. Overlord seemed pretty unbothered by just about everything ever, right? But then Vindicator is like, so you're just another John Redbridge? Like they're a dime a dozen. Do you know how many John Redbridge clones there are laying around? And this guy, we didn't say he was specifically a clone because then there's like variants from other timelines and there's, all sorts of, other takes on it. But Vindicator, like the interesting thing was the one thing I decided for Overlord was that he was arrogant and that he thinks he's the best villain ever because he'd never been caught and never done this and never done that, blah 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 blah. So like Vindicator is like he picked the one thing that would bother him and managed to say that. And so then that was interesting. And then Vindicator was just kind of like this mouthy kid that pretty much right away decides he's going to somehow run this team. He doesn't know how yet, but he's going to be running this team. And Vindicator kind of tells him to like get in line or, eat sun basically. And, um, or no, I'm sorry. Overlord said that to Vindicator is what I meant. Overlord told Vindicator to get in line or he put him back in the sun. And it was just very interesting that they had this back and forth thing. Like, man, I don't know how to describe it. I guess on some level it reminded me of Megatron and Starscream in a good way. So that was going on, and then finally, once all the villains are pretty much willing to obey, he's like, okay, you can leave this dimension now. And so he starts to actually lead the villains in attacks against the heroes that were the current heroes of that time period. And the villains are just wiping the floor with the heroes. Like it's not even close. Um, it's just ridiculous, the levels of power these guys had. And so it's like something I've said in some of my other podcast episodes is I don't decide how the heroes are going to win. I just have faith that in the past the heroes always think of something, right? And I'm like, yeah, they're going to win somehow. And ironically, this time they didn't. And like the bad guys pretty much won. And we didn't really know what to do. And so finally, the bad guys, long story short, go back to the 50s because they've got this black pyramid that can do anything ever and yada, yada, yada. The bad guys just are decimating the heroes and they decide to go back in time to there's this key moment in history when there's going to be a big alien invasion because the 50s, of course, we're doing a lot of stuff from like 50s B movies and stuff like that. So there were like a lot of alien invasions in the 1950s, but that was the reason the villains went back there. And then there was this one hero, and she wasn't particularly that tough, But so her dad was Ryan Miller's character, who I mentioned earlier, right? And then her mom was actually a variant from another universe that was a female version of Umbra. It's kind of a long story, but I went to a comic book convention at one point in maybe 1999, I want to say. But I went to Mid Ohio Con and there was this guy there, and I think his name is Jeff Moy. And he was one of the artists on Legion of Superheroes. And so we were showing him the characters from our role-playing game, and he wanted to draw Umbra, but wanted her to be a girl. And I was like, dude, I don't really want to like pay you money to like not get my character right. You know what I mean? And he's like, okay, it'll be free. And he did. And he just drew like a really sexy picture of a female Umbra, and everybody loved it except for Jay, who played Umbra. And he was so mad. And then I think Ryan came up with the name Fembra. So yeah, it's Fembra, and we came up with the idea of what is it? Is Rule 63 the rule where out there in the multiverse or whatever, there's always like uh a gender bent version of every character, something like that. So like we said it was like Earth K63 or whatever was this alternate dimension, but so there's a Fembra from there. And by the way, there was also a John Redbridge from that world, whose name was I want to say Sheena Shinku, which I think was basically Japanese for John Redbridge or something like that. I don't know. It's been like a really long time, and we have only mentioned her a few times. But at any rate, yeah. So then Fember, the female version of Jay's character and the male, Ryan's character had a kid, and her name is Eldridge. I think her real name is Ellie. But at any rate, she had the powers of basically Jay and Ryan, right? So it was like time travel from Ryan and dimension travel from Jay, and like fire from Ryan and lightning from Jay, and super intelligence from Ryan and super dexterity from Jay. You get the gist. So she runs back in time, and part of what's going on there then is we also brought in the Time Variance Authority from the Loki TV show, and they had a bunch of infinity gems in the drawers of their desk. And so she goes there to talk to them because the villains are going to change the timeline, right? And by the way, Overlord, this is important to mention, has a advantage from GURP supers called temporal inertia. So that means if time changes, he still remembers everything. So to understand that, just think of the ending of Back to the Future 1, right? Where at the end of the movie, when Marty comes back to the future and he has changed things because his parent, like his dad is a author now and stuff like that, right? Marty remembers how it used to be though. So Marty has temporal inertia, right? So that's Overlord has that when a lot of characters don't. And so Overlord is like changing the past and it's creating time quakes in the modern day. And so everything from a time point of view, everything's just hitting the fan. So the TVA has things from other time periods running around in it, like velociraptors running around in the hallways, eating agents and stuff like that, while they are distracted by all of this. Um, so Eldridge goes to one of these desk drawers full of infinity gems, and the idea is that because an infinity gem loses its charge if it leaves its home dimension, right? So that is what has happened to all these. That's why they're only good for being paperweights now, is because they're not from this dimension that the TVA headquarters is in. So she grabs a bunch of them though, and it's sort of like each one of these things has kind of like a life bar in a video game, basically, that is low, but there's still a little bit of juice in them, right? So she gets like a big bag, full of infinity gems, and she goes back in time to the 50s to when all of this stuff, went wrong. And the one guy that she decides that she can go to for help, the guy who was always there, who would always help the superhero community in times of need. And if there was ever a party of characters and it looked like it was going to be a total party kill, he would step in and save them and so on and so forth. It was John Redbridge, right? So she finds John Redbridge and she like basically is like, this is the situation. These guys are here. Nobody in the future can deal with them. Please help. And she's like, I don't know if you can do anything with this, but like, here's like a bag of dead infinity gems. For the love of God, this is too big for me. And by the way, because this is relevant, right? Sometimes the out of game stuff is relevant. I've mentioned this in other podcast episodes. My wife has these mini strokes and she has them a lot, right? And so we try to not overwhelm them. So for my wife to just literally kind of hand the adventure over to an NPC and say, please fix this, I feel overwhelmed, understand the implications of this statement, right? So John Redbridge, uh, the Infinity Gems are not useful for much because they're so weak. But the one thing they are able to do is tell him where the actual Infinity Gems of his world are in that year. And I can't remember now if that was 1952 or 1954. It was like something like that. I don't have it in front of me right now, so I'd have to look it up. But the gist is he finds the actual Infinity Gems for that year, which means Eldridge had changed time. That is not how things were in the original timeline. He didn't have the gems that early on, right? She knew he had them in the 90s and had been a big hero and helped with the big crisis of 1997 and so on and so forth. But so now he suddenly has them in the 50s, years like 40 years early or whatever. So using the gems then, that's what it took to beat these guys, these 13 unbeatable villains. He finally defeats them with the Infinity Gauntlet. And ironically puts them in the sun, right? And so then the idea is that, like I said, she had changed time, right? And Overlord has temporal inertia. So then the idea is the next sort of moment that we get with him is because that the thing in the 50s, that was a game we ran. And since she felt overwhelmed, we just said, okay, that's it for this week's game session. So then the next week, when I start running the game and everybody had been playing villains and stuff like that, the first moment we started with is Overlord wakes up and he remembers all of that. And so the idea is now he's in this new timeline, right? Just like I said, Marty McFly remembers the timeline where his dad was a loser. Now he's in the timeline where his dad is successful, right? So Overlord uses his Black Pyramid to get the guys out of the sun and put them into the back rooms, right? He puts them in the liminal space. They fight each other. But now he knows how it's going to go. He knows that if he takes them out of liminal space right now, that he's going to lose, and it's like really the only time he ever actually takes action, then he loses in the end, which would, in his mind, again, his whole thing was arrogance. He sees that as a 100% failure rate. So he gets mad and he decides to do nothing this time around. And instead, he goes back to watching Heroes and thinking to plan his next move. And I mean, for me, I liked it. I thought that was pretty cool. So, in terms of time, there, we did like a little roller coaster loop kind of a thing. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? Um, it is, we get into some timey-wimey stuff, and I know that's not everybody's cup of tea, and probably no time travel adventure in a role-playing game ever is, completely perfect or anything like that, but we liked it. Hopefully you liked it too. If so, as always, we would love it if you took a moment of your time to smash the like button, check to see if you're still subscribed because YouTube loves to unsubscribe you without telling you, and leave us a comment. That helps us out with the YouTube algorithm, and we love hearing from you guys. So, from everybody here associated with the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll catch you in the next adventure. Bye.